I never used to believe in karma. I believed the universe didn't care about justice. It just happened. But that was before my sister Allie's body was found. They discovered her in a ditch, leaves and mud in her hair, skin dulled and gray, glassy eyes reflecting the sky, so lifeless. It was hard to imagine my supernova of a sister, all laughter and energy gone from her eyes. No one could tell why a healthy 18-year-old girl died. The autopsy revealed absolutely nothing. The grief that overtook us was so enormous, it devoured the entire small town in its wake. The days and weeks that followed, things only got worse. The streets were empty. Our high school halls were silent, despite being filled with students. Shops closed early for lack of customers. Everyone carried the haunting in their face. The death of a teenage girl in such a close-knit community was a terrible thing. When the second girl, Samantha, was found a week later in a field, her glassy eyes looking skyward, just like my sister, everyone came to the slow, horrible realization together. Death had come to visit, but instead of leaving, it had chose to stay. One death without cause is a tragedy, but two was reason to panic. People stopped letting their daughters out of their sights, my mother included. I was 16, friendless, and a huge nerd. I couldn't seem to convince her for the life of me that both the girls who had been killed were a type. Beautiful, funny, and intelligent. The exact opposite of me. I was the mousy kid who forever had my nose in a book. The place I visited the most was the library, and the fact I wasn't allowed there was the worst thing that could have happened to me. But it makes no sense, I yelled at my mother, as she made spaghetti bolognese for dinner. Every movement of her arm as she stirred looked like she was fighting weights pulling her down. She hadn't smiled since Allie died. Jessie, please just go to your room. Her voice was tired. You aren't stopping Lewis from going out. Why me? My 19-year-old brother Lewis, who was sitting in the living room watching television, leaned his head back so he could catch my eye and glared. I ignored him. Mom, you're being... Jessica Rose Samuels. You will go to your room now. My mother had clearly had enough. She was looking right at me now, her face so furious it was red. This was the first actual emotion she had shown since the funeral. Between the gravity of that and the evisceration of my freedom, I recoiled, burst into tears, and tore up the stairs. I threw myself on my bed and sobbed, the way teenage girls do, as though the world is ending. The locking up of teenage girls didn't stop the bodies from appearing though. Even with every parent's eye on them, girls kept dying. Sarah Jane was just found in her garden when her mother had told her to rake up the leaves. Elizabeth was found by the mouth of the woods by her house when her mother was just in the kitchen, just 100 feet away. No cause of death for any of them. Finally, our mayor called a meeting. All young women, she said in her calm, monotonous voice, must be accompanied at all times. They cannot be alone for 1 second. Parents agreed. All of us sat in mutinous silence, unable to articulate our anger and frustration. Even if we did, who would listen to us? This infuriating level of control still didn't stop death's chilling hand, closing around life after life. Girls started dying in their beds in locked houses. The FBI was called when the 6th girl, Anna, from my 6th period math class was discovered dead in her bed. They questioned everyone. Since my sister was the first, they came to my house first. The officer who interviewed me was kind. "Do you remember anything strange about the day your sister went missing?" I shook my head. "No, she just ate breakfast and left for school early for swim practice." "Was anyone following her? Was her behavior any different?" "No," I lied carefully. "Everything was fine." In truth, Allie was behaving strangely, but I had only just realized it when the agent asked me about it. She had gone quieter around us. I would hear her talking to Mom in hushed whispers, but they would stop when I or Lewis would approach. I found her staring out her window at the forest, then quickly looked away, her breathing heavy. I just ignored it, thinking she was going through boy trouble, or something simple like that. God, I felt so guilty. So guilty for not asking her what was wrong, for not pressuring her to tell me. I could have helped. I shook my head and came back into the room. "If you think of anything," she was saying to me as she handed me her card and tapped it once, "just call this number." Look, I know this was stupid, but I was 16. I had just lost my sister and fancied myself Nancy Drew. I lied because I thought I could do better, because I knew this town better than them, and she was my sister. I wish I hadn't. I wish I let the FBI agents do their job. Instead, I found myself in the front garden, walking towards the woods across the road in the middle of the night. Between my mother's sleeping pills and my brother's excessive drinking to dull the pain, sneaking out was easy. Every sound made my bones rattle. The leaves under my feet, the sound of owls, a dog's howl in the distance. It didn't help that there was fog beginning to set over the town. I pulled my thick winter jacket around myself harder. Just as I crossed the road and reached the mouth of the woods, I heard it. It sounded like a baby crying. I should have turned at that very moment and ran back home, to the safety of my house and my family. I didn't. I stood rooted to the spot for a second, and then, almost as though I was hypnotized, I began to walk in the direction of the voice. I walked for what felt like hours. Our isolated town was in the middle of 1,000 acres of forest, on top of a mountain. The crying got louder. I heard it again and walked faster. The fog had almost set into the forest now, making it harder to see. The trees loomed, looking almost like figures in the dark, their branches, limbs. I paused for a moment, and suddenly, the cry sounded like it was right by my ear. I jumped and nearly screamed. The torch fell from my hand, and I scrambled to the ground to grab it, and my fingers closed around what I thought was the thin, cold stem of my small torch. Thinking I found it, I lifted it up but found it stuck. It was so dark, I couldn't see, and I just yanked. A second later, the torch rolled to my feet. But if that was my torch, I dropped what I was holding to slowly pick up my torch, to shine it in the direction of what I had lifted. But before I could look, long, thin, cold fingers closed around my shoulders. My eyes widened. I turned around slowly. The chill from the fingers found its way into my bones. What I saw standing there that night in the forest, it still haunts my sleep every night. Its face was shrouded in a hooded cloak. The only thing visible, its wrinkled, long-nailed black hands. The creature stepped closer, bringing forth the darkness of its hood closer to my face. and a voice that sounded feminine, but in the most demonic of ways, whispered, "Go home, child. You have not warranted a visit from us yet." It reached out to me and I scrambled backwards, fight or flight struggling inside me. My mind was racing. What are you? But somewhere inside I knew what this was. Instead of waiting for an answer, I ran home, a terrifying scream trapped in my throat. I don't know how I made my way back home that night. I think I just ran where the forest took me. I followed my feet, my body shuddering until I was home. I called the number the FBI agent had given me. I told her everything of what I had discovered in the woods. The crying baby. I must have sounded crazy, but she humored me anyway. The next day, they searched the woods, but they didn't find the creature I had found. They found something else. Something worse. Shallow graves in the heart of the forest. The bodies of at least 100 infants. Some already decomposed into skeletons. Some decaying. And some as fresh as yesterday. It didn't take long after that for them to arrest my mother and the other mothers of the dead girls. The newspapers are full of stories of witchcraft. They say my mother was a high priestess, that all the dead girls' mothers were involved in a coven-like cult that ate their children, that generations of our families had been involved in this, and that was why we all stayed in this isolated town so high up in the woods. I don't know what to believe. All I know is, I'm never ever going to see my mother again. At least now. I do know now why my sister and the other 5 girls were targeted, why Allie was so spooked the last few days before she died. I think my mother had told her about the bodies in the forest, and what she was doing with them. I also know why the causes of their deaths were never ever determined. Karma was not in the habit of leaving fingerprints or evidence on its victims. But that isn't the most terrifying thing about this. The thing that scares me the most, even after all these years, it was the last words of the demon in the forest. The thing I know to be karma, that I hadn't warranted a visit from it. Yet.